The plating on this duck confit lacks the refinement our Michelin inspectors expect, Victoria. They're evaluating us for a star tonight, my restaurant owner said, dismissing my signature dish in front of our investors. The investors looked uncertain, reconsidering their confidence in our culinary vision. My partner, Marcus DeLuca, smiled warmly and gestured toward the beautifully plated dish I'd spent months perfecting. Let me explain the innovative technique I developed for this dish that elevates traditional French bistro cuisine to Michelin star quality. I stood at my station in our Manhattan kitchen, watching Marcus present culinary work that was unmistakably mine. The duck confit with maple gastrique was mine, developed through countless hours of testing cooking temperatures, reducing sauces, and sourcing heritage breed ducks from upstate farms. The innovative plating that balanced rustic French tradition with modern elegance was mine, refined through years of classical training and creative evolution. The flavor profile combining earthy duck with bright Vermont maple and aromatic thyme was mine, inspired by my grandmother's French-American cooking. Even the specific technique for achieving perfectly crispy skin while maintaining tender, flavorful meat came from methods I'd learned during my stage in Paris and perfected over 2 years. This was the 23rd time in 18 months that Marcus had stolen credit for my culinary creations and positioned himself as the creative genius despite contributing almost nothing to actual menu development or cooking technique. I'd documented every instance meticulously, building comprehensive evidence. I'd gathered proof through dated recipe notebooks showing my development process, time-stamped photographs of dishes during creation, supplier purchase orders proving my ingredient selections, and kitchen staff testimony confirming I'd created every dish Marcus claimed as his innovation. Because what neither Marcus nor these investors knew was that I'd already secured written commitments from our entire kitchen brigade to join my independent restaurant. I'd obtained signed statements from our sous chef and line cooks confirming Marcus's systematic credit theft. I'd been approached by 3 major restaurant investment groups about backing my own establishment. I'd also consulted extensively with culinary industry attorneys who confirmed Marcus had violated partnership agreements and potentially intellectual property protections through his fraudulent misrepresentation of my creative work. In exactly 72 hours, I would confront Marcus during our Michelin inspection dinner, revealing publicly that he'd been claiming credit for my culinary innovations while I actually created every dish that made our restaurant worthy of consideration for a star. His reputation would collapse when the culinary community learned he'd built his success on stolen recipes. My restaurant would launch successfully with the brigade and investors who valued my actual culinary talent. Before we witness how a talented executive chef whose recipes were stolen used documentation and culinary community loyalty to destroy her fraudulent partner while building her own Michelin-starred restaurant, I want to thank you for being part of this community. A community that believes culinary fraud deserves serious consequences. A community that understands stolen recipe credit should be exposed and punished. If you've had your recipes stolen by partners, if you've watched restaurant owners claim credit for dishes you created, if you've been the invisible chef behind someone else's success while they collected Michelin stars and culinary awards, this story will resonate deeply. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories where documentation and determination overcome exploitation. Now let's step into the world of fine dining where a brilliant chef's recipes were systematically stolen by her restaurant owner partner. Where restaurant hierarchies enabled ongoing fraud. Where 18 months of careful preparation created the foundation for complete exposure and justice. My name is Victoria Hayes, and I'm a 33-year-old executive chef originally from Burlington, Vermont. I grew up in a family where French culinary tradition and American ingredients merged beautifully. My grandmother, Marie, had emigrated from Lyon and opened a small French bistro in Burlington that became legendary for authentic cuisine made with local Vermont ingredients. My father, James, managed the restaurant's business operations while my grandmother ruled the kitchen with precision and passion. I was surrounded from childhood by the intoxicating aromas of slowly braising meats, the sight of perfectly emulsified sauces, and the profound satisfaction that came from creating food that nourished both body and soul. Growing up in my grandmother's restaurant kitchen, I spent countless hours perched on a stool watching her work. She moved through the kitchen with ballet-like grace, her hands performing tasks with muscle memory developed over 60 years of cooking. She'd explain everything in her lilting French accent mixed with Vermont directness. "Victoria, ma chérie, you must respect the ingredients. Good cooking is not about complexity, it's about understanding what each element can become when treated with proper technique and genuine care." I learned to make bechamel when I was 7 years old, standing on a step stool at the stove while my grandmother guided my hand holding the whisk. "Keep moving, always moving, or the flour will burn and your sauce will be ruined," she instructed. The satisfaction of watching that sauce come together smoothly, transforming from grainy white liquid into silky perfection, was magical. I was hooked from that moment. By age 10, I could break down a whole chicken, make basic French mother sauces, and properly season and sear proteins. My grandmother taught me that cooking was about understanding fundamentals so deeply that innovation became possible. She emphasized that you couldn't break rules creatively until you'd mastered them completely. Those lessons shaped my entire culinary philosophy. My most profound early cooking memory happened when I was 13. My grandmother was preparing her signature coq au vin for a special anniversary dinner at the restaurant. She let me assist with every step. We marinated the chicken overnight in good Burgundy with aromatics. The next day, we carefully browned the meat, built the sauce with pearl onions and mushrooms, braised everything slowly until the chicken was fall-apart tender and the sauce had reduced to complex wine dark perfection. When the dish went out to the anniversary couple and we later heard they'd called it the best coq au vin outside of France, I understood viscerally what food could do. It could transport people, evoke memories, create moments of pure happiness. That's when I decided, with absolute certainty, that I wanted to be a chef. Not just someone who cooked, but someone who created experiences through food. My parents initially worried about the demanding, often brutal restaurant industry. They knew the long hours, the physical exhaustion, the intense pressure, and the high failure rate. They wanted me to go to college, study business, have a more stable career path. But they also saw my passion and knew my grandmother's influence was too strong to override. When I was 16, I staged at my grandmother's restaurant during summer, working as a commis in the actual brigade system she maintained even in a small Vermont bistro. She didn't give me special treatment because I was family. I peeled potatoes, cleaned vegetables, and performed the unglamorous grunt work every young cook must master. She was harder on me than on anyone else, demanding perfection in even the simplest prep tasks. "If you cannot perfectly brunoise a carrot, you have no business attempting more complex preparations," she'd say sternly when my knife cuts weren't uniform enough. Those summers taught me discipline, precision, and the humility required to truly learn in a professional kitchen. They also confirmed that the restaurant life, with all its difficulties, was exactly what I wanted. After high school, I earned admission to Le Cordon Bleu in Paris, one of the world's most prestigious culinary institutions. My grandmother was thrilled. "You will learn proper French technique," she said with satisfaction. "Then you will come back and create your own style, just as I did when I came to America." That blessing, from the chef I admired most, meant everything. Le Cordon Bleu was transformative and brutally demanding. The program combined classical French technique with modern culinary innovation, taught by chefs who'd earned Michelin stars and trained at legendary restaurants. During my first year, I studied basic technique with obsessive focus. Knife skills, sauce work, classical preparations, the fundamentals that separated competent cooks from true chefs. I learned to make consommé so clear you could read through it, clarified through patient technique and understanding of protein coagulation. I mastered the 5 mother sauces and their derivatives, understanding not just recipes but the underlying chemistry that made them work. I studied meat cookery, learning to judge doneness by touch, to rest proteins properly, to render fat without burning. The program was intensely competitive. We were evaluated constantly, with instructors who showed no mercy for imperfect work. I spent 16-hour days in the kitchen, practicing cuts, perfecting sauces, repeating preparations until they were flawless. My hands developed calluses and burn scars, the permanent marks of a working chef. I loved every demanding, exhausting moment. During my second year, I focused on advanced technique and began developing my own culinary voice. I took classes in pastry, learning precision that pastry work demands. I studied regional French cuisine, understanding how dishes evolved from specific ingredients, traditions, and techniques unique to different areas. I learned about garde-manger, charcuterie, and the art of preservation. But most importantly, I began thinking about how to bridge my French training with my American background and my grandmother's Vermont bistro influence. I started creating dishes that honored classical French technique but incorporated seasonal American ingredients and the farm-to-table philosophy I'd absorbed growing up in Vermont's agricultural community. One of my student projects was a reinterpretation of my grandmother's coq au vin using Hudson Valley duck, Vermont maple in the sauce reduction, and wild mushrooms foraged from the Adirondacks. My instructor, Chef Bernard Leckler, a 2-star Michelin chef, tasted it thoughtfully. "This is interesting," he said, which from him was high praise. "You understand the classical preparation well enough to evolve it authentically. The maple is unexpected but works because you've balanced it properly. Continue developing this voice." That encouragement validated my instinct that I didn't need to choose between French technique and American ingredients, between honoring tradition and innovating. I could do both if I understood the fundamentals deeply enough. That became my culinary philosophy: respect tradition, understand technique, then create something personal and contemporary. During my final year at Le Cordon Bleu, I had the extraordinary opportunity to stage at Alain Ducasse's restaurant in Paris, one of the most legendary establishments in fine dining. Ducasse's restaurant held 3 Michelin stars and represented the pinnacle of French culinary excellence. Working there, even as an unpaid intern doing basic prep work, was an immense privilege and education. The stage was grueling. I worked 15-hour days, 6 days a week, for no pay. I did the most basic, repetitive tasks: peeling vegetables, cleaning fish, preparing mise en place for the line cooks. The hierarchy in a 3-star Michelin kitchen was absolute. As the lowliest stage, I barely spoke unless directly addressed. I simply observed, learned, and tried not to make mistakes that would get me dismissed. But what I learned was invaluable. I watched chefs work with a level of precision and consistency I'd never imagined possible. Every plate that left the kitchen was identical, perfectly composed, executed with absolute technical mastery. I learned that Michelin star cooking wasn't about creativity alone, it was about executing at the highest level repeatedly, consistently, under enormous pressure, night after night. I learned about sourcing, watching how the restaurant worked with specific farmers and suppliers to get ingredients at peak quality. I learned about seasonality, how the menu evolved constantly to showcase whatever was at its absolute best. I learned about the obsessive attention to detail that separated good restaurants from truly great ones. Most valuably, I learned from watching Chef Ducasse himself. He'd visit the kitchen regularly, tasting, observing, correcting with minimal words but maximum impact. Once, he tasted a sauce I'd helped prepare and paused. "This is slightly too reduced," he said quietly. 30 seconds less next time. His palate could detect differences I couldn't yet perceive. That level of refinement became my aspiration. After completing Le Cordon Bleu with honors and my stage at Ducasse's restaurant, I knew I wanted to return to America to cook. I loved French cuisine and technique, but I wanted to cook in the dynamic, innovative American fine dining scene where chefs were pushing boundaries while drawing on diverse culinary traditions. I moved to New York City at 25, ready to prove myself in one of the world's most competitive culinary markets. I started as a line cook at a well-regarded French restaurant in Tribeca, working the fish station. It was humbling after my training, being the newest, lowest-ranking member of the brigade. But I knew I needed to pay my dues and learn the specific demands of New York fine dining service. Working the line in a busy New York restaurant was intense. During peak service, we'd do 250 covers in a night, with tickets constantly printing, the chef de cuisine calling orders in rapid-fire French, every station needing to time dishes perfectly so plates could go out together. The physical demands were brutal. Standing in one spot for 5 hours straight, the heat from the stove, the constant motion, the mental focus required to execute perfectly while pressure mounted. But I thrived in that environment. I loved the adrenaline, the precision, the teamwork required to make a busy service flow smoothly. I loved the satisfaction of executing a perfect sear on fish, of plating dozens of dishes identically, of being part of a brigade that functioned like a well-oiled machine. Within 6 months, I'd proven myself reliable and skilled enough to be promoted to chef de partie, running my own station. Over the next 3 years, I worked my way up through the kitchen hierarchy at that restaurant and then at a highly regarded modern American restaurant in the West Village. I became a junior sous chef, then sous chef, learning not just cooking but leadership, menu development, and the business aspects of running a fine dining kitchen. I learned how to manage other cooks, how to teach technique, how to maintain standards during the chaos of service. I also began developing my culinary voice more intentionally during these years. On my rare days off, I'd experiment at home, creating dishes that merged my French training with seasonal American ingredients and Vermont influences. I developed a duck confit using Hudson Valley ducks and a maple gastrique that combined my grandmother's Vermont maple with classical French technique. I created a play on coq au vin using American wine and local mushrooms. I experimented with American seafood prepared with French methods. These experiments weren't just for fun. I was building a portfolio of signature dishes, developing the style that would eventually define my own kitchen. I documented everything meticulously in recipe notebooks, recording not just ingredients and techniques but the evolution of each dish through multiple iterations, what worked, what didn't, why I made specific choices. By age 30, I'd worked in some of New York's best kitchens and was ready for the next step, becoming an executive chef with creative control over a menu. I started interviewing for executive chef positions at new restaurant openings and established places looking for new leadership. That's when I met Marcus DeLuca at a hospitality industry event in Manhattan. Marcus was 42, charismatic, a successful restaurateur who'd opened several Italian restaurants that had done well financially though none had achieved significant critical acclaim. He told me he wanted to open an upscale French-American restaurant targeting Michelin consideration, and he needed a talented executive chef to develop the culinary vision while he handled business operations and front-of-house management. We met several times to discuss the opportunity. Marcus presented himself as someone who understood fine dining business but needed a chef with serious culinary credentials to create a Michelin-worthy menu. He was enthusiastic about my training at Le Cordon Bleu and my stage at Ducasse's restaurant. He said he wanted to create something genuinely excellent, not just another Manhattan restaurant, but a destination that could earn culinary recognition. The arrangement seemed ideal for what I wanted professionally. I'd be executive chef with complete creative control over the menu, sourcing, and kitchen operations. Marcus would handle finances, management, investor relations, and front-of-house operations. We'd split ownership, with me having substantial equity in exchange for my culinary leadership and menu development. On paper, it looked like a perfect partnership combining my culinary expertise with his business experience. We agreed on terms, signed partnership agreements, and began preparing to open the restaurant. Marcus secured a beautiful space in Manhattan's Flatiron district with high ceilings, excellent bones, and enough room for a proper kitchen. I began developing the opening menu, a seasonal French-American concept showcasing classical technique with exceptional American ingredients. The development process was thrilling and creatively fulfilling. I created dishes that represented my culinary evolution, French technique from Le Cordon Bleu and my stage at Ducasse's, Vermont influences from my grandmother's cooking, and the seasonal American ingredient focus I'd developed working in New York. Each dish told a story about my culinary journey while being delicious and technically excellent. My opening menu included my signature duck confit with maple gastrique, a dish that perfectly represented my style. The duck itself was heritage breed from a small Hudson Valley farm, treated with classical confit technique I'd learned in Paris, slowly cooked in its own fat until impossibly tender, then crisped at service and paired with a gastrique that balanced Vermont maple sweetness with bright vinegar acidity and aromatic fresh thyme. The plating combined rustic French bistro warmth with modern elegance. I also developed a seared scallops dish with black truffle beurre blanc that showcased perfect technical execution. The scallops were pristine diver caught from Maine, seared quickly to develop a golden crust while staying barely cooked in the center. The sauce was classical French beurre blanc enriched with earthy black truffle, luxurious and perfectly balanced. The dish was simple in concept but demanded absolute precision in execution. For meat, I created a modern interpretation of coq au vin using free-range chicken from Pennsylvania, wine from the Finger Lakes, and mushrooms foraged from upstate New York. The technique was classical French but the ingredients were proudly American. I deconstructed the traditional presentation, serving the chicken components separately so guests could appreciate each element: the wine-braised dark meat, the roasted breast, the rich sauce studded with pearl onions and mushrooms. My dessert course featured a lavender honey crème brûlée that combined French technique with American lavender and local honey. The custard was silky, perfumed subtly with lavender, sweetened with floral honey, topped with caramelized sugar that cracked perfectly under a spoon. It was elegant, technically perfect, and delicious. Each dish required months of development. I tested versions repeatedly, adjusting techniques, refining flavors, perfecting presentations. I documented everything in my recipe notebooks with dated entries showing the evolution. I worked with specific suppliers to source the best ingredients, building relationships with farmers and purveyors who could provide what I needed consistently. Marcus observed my development process with what seemed like genuine interest and respect. He'd taste dishes, offer feedback mostly about business considerations like food costs and plating time, and express enthusiasm about the menu's potential. He seemed content to let me handle all culinary decisions while he focused on restaurant business aspects. We opened the restaurant 8 months after signing our partnership agreement. The space was beautiful: warm lighting, comfortable seating, an open kitchen where guests could watch us cook. My brigade included a talented sous chef named Claire, experienced line cooks I'd recruited from top restaurants, and a dedicated pastry assistant. We'd trained intensely before opening, ensuring everyone understood my standards and could execute the menu consistently. Opening night was magical. The dining room filled with industry people, food media, and early supporters. I worked the pass, calling orders, checking every plate, ensuring everything leaving my kitchen met my standards. Service flowed smoothly. Dishes went out beautifully. The feedback from the dining room was overwhelmingly positive. Guests praised the food's technical excellence, creative vision, and delicious flavors. The early reviews were excellent. New York food bloggers wrote enthusiastically about my cooking, calling my duck confit a revelation, and my scallops perfectly executed. Eater published a feature about the restaurant, describing my French training and highlighting my signature dishes. The buzz built quickly, with reservations becoming difficult to secure. But I soon noticed concerning patterns emerging that made me question Marcus's integrity and honesty. During important tastings with investors and food media, Marcus would position himself as the creative force behind the menu despite having contributed nothing to recipe development or culinary decisions. He'd describe dishes using the first person, saying, "I created this duck confit to showcase Hudson Valley ingredients," or, "My interpretation of coq au vin bridges French tradition with American terroir." The first few times I heard this, I was too shocked to react immediately. We were partners, and I assumed we'd eventually clarify attribution publicly. But the pattern intensified. Marcus started giving interviews to food publications where he'd describe his culinary vision and his signature dishes, presenting my creative work as his innovations. Food writers naturally assumed the restaurant owner was the creative genius, especially since I was often too busy actually cooking to do publicity. The first undeniable instance of recipe theft happened 4 months after opening when Marcus scheduled a private tasting for major investors who were considering backing his expansion plans. He asked me to prepare my signature dishes, which I did, assuming I'd be presenting them and explaining the culinary concepts behind each creation. Instead, Marcus kept me in the kitchen while he presented each dish to the investors himself, positioning himself as the creative genius while I remained invisible in the back. I could hear him through the kitchen pass, his voice carrying clearly into the kitchen where my brigade and I stood listening in growing disbelief. He was describing my duck confit as a dish I developed combining my grandmother's Italian cooking traditions with French technique I learned during my training in Europe. Every word was a lie. The dish had nothing to do with Italian traditions and everything to do with my French training at Le Cordon Bleu, my Vermont grandmother's French bistro cooking, and months of experimentation I'd done perfecting the maple gastrique. The duck itself required careful sourcing. I'd spent weeks researching heritage breed duck farms in the Hudson Valley, visiting operations, tasting their ducks, learning about their raising practices. I'd selected a specific farm whose ducks had the perfect fat-to-meat ratio and flavor profile I wanted. The confit technique itself came from classical French method I'd learned in Paris. Salting the duck legs, letting them cure overnight, then cooking slowly in rendered duck fat at precisely 200 degrees Fahrenheit for exactly 8 hours until the meat was impossibly tender while the skin could be crisped perfectly at service. The maple gastrique was its own journey of development. I'd tested a dozen Vermont maple syrups before finding one with the right balance of sweetness and complexity. The gastrique technique, reducing the maple with quality vinegar and aromatics, required precise timing and temperature control. Too much reduction and the sauce became cloying, too little and it lacked intensity. I'd made that sauce 50 times before achieving the perfect balance where maple sweetness was cut by vinegar brightness and enhanced by fresh thyme aromatics. Listening to Marcus describe my technique for achieving the perfect crispy skin, when I developed that technique through years of experimentation made my hands shake with suppressed rage. The technique involved a specific 2-stage cooking process. The long confit followed by a quick high-heat sear that crisped the skin without overcooking the tender meat inside. I'd taught him that method just weeks earlier when he'd wandered into the kitchen and asked out of casual curiosity how I achieved such consistent results. He presented my scallops with truffle beurre blanc next, describing it as my signature dish, inspired by my training in Italy and refined through years of technical development. The layers of dishonesty in that statement were staggering. Marcus had never trained in Italy or anywhere else culinarily. The dish was based entirely on classical French beurre blanc technique I'd learned at Le Cordon Bleu, refined during my stage at Ducasse's 3-star restaurant where I'd watched master sauciers create perfect emulsified butter sauces hundreds of times. The scallops themselves required pristine sourcing and precise technique. I'd developed relationships with specific Maine scallop divers who could provide day boat diver caught scallops, the highest quality available. These weren't the water-injected supermarket scallops most restaurants used, but genuinely fresh, dry-packed scallops that caramelized beautifully and had sweet, clean flavor. Each scallop cost several dollars wholesale, but the quality difference was undeniable. The cooking technique was deceptively simple but demanded absolute precision. The scallops needed to be absolutely dry before searing, seared in a ripping hot pan with just enough fat, turned exactly once when a golden crust formed, cooked just until the interior reached the perfect barely translucent state. Seconds too long and they became rubbery, seconds too short and they were cold in the center. I'd cooked thousands of scallops learning to judge doneness by touch and appearance. The beurre blanc sauce was its own technical challenge. The classical technique involved reducing white wine and shallots, then mounting cold butter piece by piece while maintaining precise temperature. Too hot and the butter would break, separating into greasy liquid, too cold and it wouldn't emulsify properly. The black truffle added at the end contributed earthy luxury that complemented the sweet scallops without overwhelming them. Marcus claimed to have sourced the perfect Maine scallops through my personal relationships with suppliers, when I'd personally developed those supplier relationships through months of outreach, tasting samples from different divers, and establishing trust with the best purveyors. I'd done all that sourcing work myself, not him. The investors were impressed, praising Marcus's culinary creativity and technical skill enthusiastically. "This is Michelin quality cooking, Marcus," one investor said. "Your European training really shows in the technique and refinement." They left believing he was the chef, that I was simply the person who executed his creative vision in the kitchen. That I was just highly skilled hands implementing someone else's genius. I stood at my station, furious and hurt, listening to someone else take credit for work I'd poured my heart into creating. My hands gripped the edge of my station so hard my knuckles went white. Claire, my sous chef, stood beside me with an expression of pure disgust. "This is insane," she whispered. "He literally cannot properly sear a scallop, and he's telling them he created your technique. This is fraud." After the investors left, I confronted Marcus immediately in his office, my anger barely controlled. "Why did you tell them you created those dishes?" I asked directly, my voice tight with emotion I was struggling to contain. "Those are my recipes. My duck confit that I developed for months before we even met. My scallops that I learned to cook in Paris. My techniques that I taught you. I developed everything." Marcus looked surprised by my directness, as if he genuinely hadn't expected me to challenge him about something he apparently saw as normal business practice. He recovered quickly, putting on his smooth business persona and offering an explanation that sounded reasonable superficially but was fundamentally dishonest and revealed his complete lack of integrity. "Victoria, you need to understand how investor meetings work," he said in a condescending tone that made my blood boil. "Investors want to hear from the business leader, the person who owns and operates the restaurant, about the restaurant's culinary vision and creative direction. I was representing our partnership and our collective work. The recipes are the restaurant's intellectual property now, not personal ownership issues we need to worry about. They're not the restaurant's property, they're my creative work," I pushed back firmly, refusing to let him rationalize away the fraud. "I spent months developing those dishes before we even opened this restaurant, before we even formed our partnership. They're my recipes, based on my training at Le Cordon Bleu and my stage at Ducasse's, my ingredient sourcing, my style. You claiming you created them is actively lying to investors about who has the culinary talent in this partnership." Marcus's expression hardened slightly, his smooth facade cracking to reveal annoyance at my resistance to his theft. "You're being territorial and emotional about credit when we should focus on building the business successfully," he said dismissively, waving his hand as if my concerns were irrational and petty. "Successful restaurants don't worry about individual attribution of specific dishes. The restaurant succeeds, we both succeed as partners. That's what matters for our shared financial interests. You're thinking like a line cook worried about ego instead of a business partner focused on success." The conversation was frustrating and deeply troubling. Marcus genuinely didn't seem to understand, or perhaps didn't care, that claiming credit for creative work you didn't do was fraudulent and unethical. He saw recipe credit as flexible and negotiable, a business tool rather than an ethical obligation or legal issue. His attitude revealed a fundamental lack of integrity that made me question our entire partnership structure and wonder what else he might be willing to lie about for business advantage. But I was invested in the restaurant's success, I'd put my reputation and career into this venture, and I wanted to believe the situation could be addressed. I told myself it was a misunderstanding, that we'd clarify attribution going forward. I was wrong. The second major recipe theft incident happened 2 months later when New York Magazine's food critic came for a review. Unbeknownst to me, Marcus had arranged a pre-review meeting with the critic where he'd described his culinary vision and presented himself as the creative force behind the menu. When the review published, it attributed all creative credit to Marcus. Chef-owner Marcus DeLuca's duck confit with maple gastrique is a masterful combination of French technique and American ingredients, the review read. De Luca, who trained in Italy and France, brings sophisticated European sensibility to Hudson Valley products with impressive results. His signature scallops showcase the technical precision he learned during his European training. Every single word of attribution was wrong. Marcus hadn't trained in Europe at all, had never attended culinary school, and certainly hadn't developed any of those techniques or dishes. The review was praising him for my work, my training, my creative vision. Readers would believe Marcus was the talented chef, when in reality he couldn't properly sear a scallop. I was devastated. The New York Magazine review was hugely important for our credibility and business. But instead of establishing my culinary reputation, it attributed everything I'd created to Marcus. Food industry people reading that review would think he was the talent, that I was just executing someone else's vision. When I confronted Marcus about the false attribution, he dismissed my concerns again. "The review is great for business," he said. "Reservations are up 30% since it published. This is good for both of us. You're too focused on individual credit instead of appreciating the restaurant's success." "The restaurant's success is built on recipes I created," I responded angrily. "That review establishes your reputation as a chef when you're not a chef. It's professional fraud. You need to contact the magazine and issue a correction." Marcus laughed, actually laughed at my demand. "No publication will print a correction about who created recipes," he said dismissively. "That's not how food media works. You need to stop being so emotional about this and focus on the kitchen. That's your job. Let me handle publicity and business. That's mine." The conversation made clear that Marcus had no intention of crediting my work accurately. He was systematically building a reputation as a talented chef owner based entirely on my culinary creations. And he saw nothing wrong with it. The third major incident happened 6 months into our opening when Marcus announced he was planning to open a second restaurant across town. I was supportive initially, thinking it meant our first restaurant was successful enough to expand. But then I learned he was planning to use my menu, my signature dishes, my recipes, at his new restaurant, positioning himself as the chef creator while hiring someone else to execute his recipes. "You can't use my recipes for another restaurant," I told him firmly when I learned about the plan. "Those dishes are my creative work. If you want to open a second location of our partnership restaurant, we can discuss it. But you can't take my recipes and use them in a separate business where I have no involvement or credit." Marcus's response was stunning in its arrogance. "The recipes belong to the restaurant, which I own the majority stake in," he said. "I can use them however I want for business purposes. You're an employee, Victoria, even if you have equity. Employees don't own the company's intellectual property." "I'm not an employee, I'm a partner," I countered, barely controlling my rage. "And recipes created before we even formed the partnership are my personal intellectual property. You cannot use my duck confit, my scallops, my coq au vin in another restaurant without my permission. That's theft." Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "Talk to your lawyer if you want, but you'll find I'm right. Focus on our restaurant and stop worrying about business decisions that don't concern you." That conversation was the breaking point. Marcus wasn't just taking convenient credit during interviews, he was planning to build an entire restaurant empire on my stolen recipes while preventing me from receiving any recognition or compensation. The fraud was comprehensive and deliberate, not accidental misunderstandings but calculated theft. The fourth major incident occurred when Michelin guide inspectors started visiting the restaurant. Michelin was the ultimate recognition in fine dining, and my menu had been developed specifically with Michelin standards in mind. Technically excellent, creative but not gimmicky, consistently executed, showcasing quality ingredients. Several industry sources told us inspectors had been in multiple times, a strong sign we were under serious consideration. During what we believed was a final inspection visit, Marcus did something that still makes me furious thinking about it. He positioned himself at the pass in the kitchen, calling orders and checking plates as if he were the chef, while relegating me to a station chef position. When the inspector asked questions about dish development and technique, Marcus answered with explanations I'd given him, presenting my creative process as his own thinking. After the inspector left, Marcus was triumphant. "I think we're going to get a star," he said excitedly. The way I explained our duck confit technique really impressed them. "This is huge for the business." "You mean huge for your reputation," I responded coldly. "If we get a Michelin star, you'll take all the credit for my cooking, won't you? You'll be known as the chef owner with a Michelin star, built entirely on my recipes and my technique." Marcus shrugged. "That's how the industry works, Victoria. The restaurant gets the star, and I'm the owner. That's how it is." The fifth and final major recipe theft incident before my eventual confrontation involved food media coverage that cemented Marcus's false reputation. Eater published a long-form profile titled, "Marcus DeLuca, the chef owner bringing French technique to American ingredients." The article positioned Marcus as a self-taught culinary genius, described his signature dishes in detail, and included recipes he claimed to have developed. The article featured my duck confit recipe with exact techniques and proportions, my scallop preparation method, my coq au vin variations, all presented as Marcus's creative work. There were photos of Marcus cooking these dishes in our kitchen, which he'd clearly staged when I wasn't there. The article even included a sidebar about Chef DeLuca's culinary philosophy that used words and concepts I'd shared with Marcus during our menu development process. Reading that article, seeing my creative work attributed completely to someone who couldn't properly dice an onion, was professionally devastating. The piece would establish Marcus's reputation permanently in food media circles. Future critics, writers, and industry people would cite this article as proof that Marcus was the culinary talent behind the restaurant. I saved the article immediately, adding it to the growing file of documentation I'd been building systematically. Because by that point, 6 months after opening, I'd started documenting everything with the understanding that I'd eventually need comprehensive evidence to protect my creative work and reputation. My documentation strategy became methodical and thorough. Every morning before the restaurant opened, I photographed my mise en place and prep work with timestamps. I kept 3 identical recipe notebooks, one at the restaurant, one at home, and one with the attorney I'd quietly consulted, each showing dated entries for every dish development, every ingredient test, every technique refinement. Each notebook entry was detailed and dated. When I developed my lavender honey crème brûlée, I documented every iteration. The failed attempts with too much lavender that overwhelmed the custard, the breakthrough when I found the perfect Provence lavender honey from a specific supplier, the precise temperature curve that produced silky custard without curdling. Anyone reviewing these notebooks would see the clear evolution of each dish, proving I'd created them. I started emailing myself recipe notes and development updates from my personal account. Breakthrough today on the duck confit. Discovered that cooking at 200 degrees Fahrenheit for exactly 8 hours produces more consistent texture than variable temperature approaches. Maple gastrique needs slightly more vinegar to balance sweetness. The email timestamps provided electronic proof of when I'd developed these techniques, predating Marcus's false claims by months. I cultivated relationships with our suppliers deliberately, ensuring purchase orders and invoices had my name and email. When I special ordered heritage ducks from Hudson Valley Farms, Maine diver scallops from specific dealers, Perigord black truffles from importers, or lavender honey from Provence suppliers, I made sure all documentation showed I was the person sourcing these ingredients. These records proved I was developing dishes requiring specific components, not just following someone else's recipes. I kept every private message and email from food critics and bloggers. When the Eater reviewer wrote privately, "Your duck confit is extraordinary. Can you tell me about your technique development?" I responded with detailed explanations of my process, then forwarded the exchange to my personal email for documentation. These communications proved critics knew I was the chef creating the dishes, even if published articles incorrectly credited Marcus. Most importantly, I built strong relationships with my kitchen brigade and made sure they understood what was happening. My sous chef Claire, line cooks James and Sophie, and pastry assistant David. They all watched Marcus take credit for my work during investor meetings, media interviews, and public events. They knew the truth about who created every dish, who developed every technique, who actually ran the kitchen. I had careful conversations with each of them, explaining that Marcus was systematically stealing credit for my culinary work and that I might eventually need their testimony. Every single person agreed to provide written statements when the time came. Claire was particularly supportive. Everyone in this kitchen knows Marcus couldn't cook his way out of a paper bag. We'll all testify that these recipes are yours. What he's doing is wrong. Their willingness to support me was both touching and strategically crucial. Kitchen staff testimony would be credible and powerful. They had no reason to lie, they'd observed everything firsthand, and their statements would corroborate every claim I made about Marcus's fraud. For 18 months, while Marcus stole credit for my present, I documented my future. Every recipe notebook entry, every timestamped photograph, every supplier invoice, every private message from critics, every kitchen staff witness. I was building a case that would eventually destroy his fraudulent reputation while establishing the truth about my creative work. During this documentation period, I also began quietly building relationships with potential investors and restaurant industry figures who might support an independent venture. I attended culinary events, networked with other chefs, and carefully planted seeds about possibly opening my own restaurant eventually. I never explicitly recruited investors while still partnered with Marcus, but I made sure people knew I was talented and might be available for new projects. I also consulted with attorneys who specialized in restaurant partnerships and intellectual property. The legal consultations revealed that while recipe theft was difficult to prosecute, Marcus's systematic fraud violated our partnership agreement and potentially constituted breach of fiduciary duty. Most importantly, the attorneys confirmed I could take my recipes and culinary style with me when I left, as long as I'd developed them before the partnership or could prove they were my personal creative work. After 18 months of documentation and preparation, I had everything needed to act. Comprehensive recipe notebooks proving I'd created every dish. Timestamped photographs showing development processes. Supplier invoices demonstrating my ingredient sourcing. Private messages from critics acknowledging my work. Kitchen staff ready to testify. Legal opinions supporting my position. The foundation was solid. I chose the night of our Michelin inspection dinner to confront Marcus publicly. The timing was strategic. Michelin inspectors would be in the dining room observing. Our investors would be present. Food media would attend. The entire restaurant community would learn the truth simultaneously, making it impossible for Marcus to control the narrative or spin the revelation favorably. I arrived at the restaurant at 8 p.m., during the height of dinner service, with my attorney Catherine Morrison, all 3 of my recipe notebooks, binders full of documentation, and my entire kitchen brigade who'd agreed to stand with me. The dining room was packed. The Michelin inspectors sat at table 12, observing every detail. Investors occupied the private dining room. Food media filled the bar area. Marcus stood at the pass in my kitchen, calling orders for dishes I'd created, positioning himself as the chef, basking in the attention and anticipation of Michelin recognition. The sight of him there, stealing my moment while claiming my work, filled me with cold fury. I walked through the kitchen door with Catherine and my brigade behind me. The kitchen went quiet. Marcus turned, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to anxiety as he saw my attorney and the serious expressions on everyone's faces. "These are my recipes, Marcus," I said loudly and clearly, my voice carrying through the kitchen and into the dining room beyond. Every single dish on tonight's menu, the duck confit, the scallops, the coq au vin, the crème brûlée, I created them. Not you. He laughed, that dismissive sound I'd heard too many times. "Victoria, you're being emotional and inappropriate. We can discuss this privately later." "No," I interrupted firmly. "We're discussing this now, here, with witnesses. The duck confit with maple gastrique. I developed it starting 14 months before we even opened this restaurant. Here's my notebook with 60 pages of testing, dated entries, timestamped photographs showing every iteration. Here's the email I sent myself 8 months before opening, describing the breakthrough technique I'd discovered. I opened the first notebook, holding it up so the Michelin inspector could see the dated entries. Catherine stepped forward with official-looking binders. The seared scallops with black truffle beurre blanc. I created it based on classical French technique I learned at Le Cordon Bleu and refined during my stage at Alain Ducasse's restaurant. Here are my original class notes from Paris showing the beurre blanc method. Here's a letter from Chef Ducasse himself confirming I staged in his kitchen. Here are the supplier invoices showing I personally sourced the main scallops and black truffles, with my name and credit card on every order. Marcus's face was pale. This is ridiculous, we're partners, the Coco Van, I continued relentlessly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. You told New York Magazine you were inspired by your Italian grandmother's cooking. That was a lie. Here's the truth. I developed this dish based on my French grandmother's recipe from her Lyon bistro in Vermont. Here's my culinary school professor from Le Cordon Bleu confirming I made this exact dish in her regional French cuisine class 7 years ago. Claire, my sous chef, stepped forward beside me. I'll testify, she said clearly. I've worked with Chef Hayes for 18 months. Every single dish Marcus has claimed as his creation, Victoria developed them. I watched her test recipes, refine techniques, source ingredients. Marcus can barely properly dice an onion. These recipes are Victoria's work, not his. James, my saucier, joined her. I'll testify too. I've seen Victoria's recipe notebooks. I've watched Marcus take credit for her work during investor meetings and media interviews. He's been lying about his culinary role since we opened. Sophie, my fish cook, stepped forward. I'll testify. Every technique Marcus has described as his innovation, Victoria taught them to us. She's the chef. He's just the owner who stole credit for her creativity. One by one, 7 members of my kitchen brigade lined up beside me, a wall of testimony. The visual impact was powerful, the entire kitchen staff standing with the real chef against the fraud. You're all fired, Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Every single one of you. No, a voice said from the doorway. Our lead investor, Richard Chen, stood there with the Michelin inspector beside him. They'd heard everything. You're finished, Marcus. Victoria, my attorney will contact you tomorrow. We need to discuss restructuring this partnership immediately. The Michelin inspector closed her evaluation notebook. She looked at me with an expression that might have been sympathy or professional interest. She made notes. I knew what they likely said: creative credit disputed, ownership questionable, kitchen loyalty clearly with Victoria. Not the kind of notes that led to stars for Marcus's restaurant. Marcus lunged for my notebooks, desperation replacing arrogance. You can't do this, we're partners. Those recipes belong to the restaurant. Catherine stepped between us smoothly. Mr. DeLuca, those notebooks document Ms. Hayes's creative work developed primarily before your partnership and clearly attributable to her training and expertise. Attempting to claim her recipes as restaurant property violates both your partnership agreement and basic intellectual property principles. I strongly suggest you consult with your own attorney. You're destroying the business, Marcus yelled, his composure completely gone. Everything I've built, everything you've built on my stolen recipes, I said quietly but firmly. Enjoy explaining to your investors and the press why your entire kitchen brigade just confirmed you've been lying about creating the food. Enjoy operating a restaurant with no chef and no staff. I'm done being invisible while you take credit for my work. The confrontation lasted another 30 minutes, with Catherine methodically presenting documentation while Marcus's denials became increasingly desperate and unconvincing. The investors, the Michelin inspector, the food media present, everyone heard and saw the comprehensive evidence of his fraud. Within 2 hours, Marcus was escorted from the restaurant by building security at the investors' instruction. They'd heard enough. The partnership was effectively dissolved, pending legal formalities. Most importantly, the truth was public. Everyone in that dining room, including key figures in New York's food community, now knew that I was the chef whose creative work had been stolen, and Marcus was the fraud who'd built his reputation on theft. 3 months later, after legal proceedings, investor negotiations, and countless meetings, I received a settlement that gave me complete ownership of my recipes, freed me from any obligations to Marcus, and provided enough capital to start my own restaurant. The investors who'd backed our original restaurant asked if they could invest in my new venture. All of them said they'd invested because of the food, and now they knew I was the chef who'd created it. I found a beautiful space in Manhattan's West Village, smaller and more intimate than the Flatiron location but perfect for what I wanted to create. I designed the restaurant myself, 45 seats, an open kitchen where guests could watch me work, warm lighting, comfortable but elegant decor. I named it Étoile, French for star, both a reference to my Michelin aspirations and a quiet claim to the recognition I deserved. My entire brigade from the previous restaurant joined me. Claire became my sous chef officially. James, Sophie, David, everyone who'd stood beside me during the confrontation came to Étoile. We were a team bound not just by professional respect but by shared understanding of what we'd been through and what we were building together. The opening menu at Étoile featured refined versions of the dishes Marcus had stolen. My duck confit, elevated further through technique improvements I'd developed during the final months at the old restaurant. My scallops, now paired with a slightly different sauce that showcased my continued evolution as a chef. My coq au vin, reimagined with even more confidence. My lavender honey crème brûlée, perfected to silk. But I also added new dishes that represented my continued growth. A pan-roasted halibut with saffron cream and spring vegetables that showcased pristine seafood and delicate sauce work. A duck breast with cherry gastrique that played with sweet tart flavors. A chocolate soufflé with salted caramel that demonstrated pastry technique. Each dish told a story about my culinary philosophy, classical French technique, seasonal American ingredients, and creative vision that honored tradition while innovating thoughtfully. Opening night at Étoile was emotional and triumphant. The dining room filled with supportive industry figures, loyal guests from the previous restaurant who'd known I was the real chef, and media interested in my story. I worked the pass, calling orders, checking every plate, ensuring everything met my standards. Service flowed beautifully. The food was excellent. The response from the dining room was overwhelmingly positive. The first review came from Eater, which had published the false profile about Marcus months earlier. Their review of Étoile was titled, "Victoria Hayes, the chef who took back her kitchen." It detailed everything: Marcus's credit theft, my documentation, the confrontation, my new restaurant. The piece went viral, shared tens of thousands of times, sparking conversations about recipe theft, credit attribution, and gender dynamics in professional kitchens. Chef Hayes's duck confit with maple gastrique is extraordinary, the review read. This is the same dish that made her previous restaurant successful, though credited then to her partner. Tasting it now, prepared in her own kitchen under her own name, feels like justice served with perfect technique. The food is exceptional, the story is important, and Étoile deserves to succeed. The New York Times followed with a 3-star review, their highest rating, calling my cooking technically impeccable, creatively intelligent, and deeply personal. They praised the duck confit as one of the city's best dishes, and noted that Chef Hayes's French training and American sensibility create cuisine that feels both classical and contemporary. Within 6 months, industry rumors suggested we were under consideration for a Michelin star. Inspectors had been spotted multiple times. The buzz was strong. My cooking was consistent, technically excellent, creative but not gimmicky, exactly what Michelin valued. I tried not to think about it too much, focusing instead on maintaining standards and continuing to evolve the menu seasonally. When the Michelin Guide released their new ratings, Étoile received 1 star. The recognition was everything I'd worked toward for my entire career. The guide's description read, "Chef Victoria Hayes brings classical French technique learned at Le Cordon Bleu and through stages in Paris to seasonal American ingredients with impressive results." Her duck confit showcases the precision and creativity that define her cooking. This is confident, accomplished cuisine from a chef with a clear personal voice. The star was mine, properly credited, earned through my actual cooking and creative work. No one could take that away or claim false credit. It was validation that felt almost overwhelming after years of watching someone else steal recognition for my creations. Meanwhile, Marcus's restaurant, still operating under his sole ownership after I left, struggled without my recipes and kitchen leadership. The chef he'd hired couldn't replicate my dishes successfully. Reviews noted the food quality had declined significantly. Reservations dropped. Within 18 months of my departure, the restaurant closed. Marcus filed for bankruptcy shortly after. The culinary community learned through professional networks and industry gossip about Marcus's fraud and the restaurant's failure. His reputation was destroyed. No serious investors would back his future restaurant ventures. Chefs and kitchen staff avoided working with him. His name became associated with creative theft and dishonesty. The career he'd built on my stolen work collapsed completely when the truth emerged. 5 years after opening Étoile, I've built something I'm genuinely proud of. The restaurant maintains its Michelin star and is consistently booked weeks in advance. I've received multiple James Beard Award nominations, recognition from my peers as one of New York's best chefs. My cooking style, French technique with American ingredients, has influenced other young chefs exploring similar approaches. I published a cookbook 3 years after opening Étoile. The book, titled Reclaiming the Kitchen, Recipes and Stories from Étoile, featured my signature dishes along with honest essays about recipe theft, creative credit, and building a career after exploitation. The publisher was enthusiastic about the combination of excellent recipes and important narrative about professional integrity. The book became a bestseller, resonating especially with women chefs who'd experienced similar credit theft. The cookbook publicity led to television opportunities. I appeared as a guest judge on Top Chef, then was offered a recurring role on a cooking competition show. Eventually, Netflix approached me about a Chef's Table episode documenting my culinary journey, the recipe theft, and how I'd built Étoile. The episode, titled Reclaiming My Voice, aired to strong reviews and introduced my story to a global audience. But beyond personal success, I've focused on advocacy, helping other chefs, particularly women, protect their creative work and receive proper attribution. The experience with Marcus taught me that recipe theft and credit misappropriation are common in the restaurant industry, often enabled by gender dynamics and power imbalances. I wanted to help others avoid what I'd endured. I developed resources about documenting recipe development, protecting creative work, and recognizing credit theft. I created template recipe notebooks showing how to document development process with dates and details that could prove authorship. I wrote guides about partnership agreements, explaining what protections chefs should demand before joining restaurants as creative leaders. These materials, available free through culinary organizations, have helped hundreds of chefs protect their work. I also offer pro bono consultations to chefs facing similar exploitation. Young women chefs contact me regularly, describing situations that mirror my experience with Marcus. Restaurant owners or senior chefs claiming credit for their recipes, media attributing their creative work to others, partnerships where their contributions go unrecognized. I help them document everything, understand their legal options, and plan strategic responses. One young chef, Maria, contacted me after reading my cookbook. She'd developed the entire menu for a new restaurant but watched the owner-chef present himself in media as the creative genius. "I've started documenting everything like you described," she told me. "But I'm terrified to confront him. What if it destroys my career?" I shared my experience honestly, explaining both the difficulty and the ultimate necessity of addressing systematic credit theft. "The documentation you're gathering is your power," I told her. "When you have comprehensive evidence, you have leverage. Don't let fear of confrontation keep you in a situation where someone builds their reputation on your stolen creative work. Your recipes deserve proper credit, and you deserve recognition for your talent." Maria eventually left her exploitative partnership and opened her own successful restaurant. She credited our conversations with giving her courage to act and guidance about doing it strategically. Helping her and others like her has become one of my most meaningful contributions beyond cooking itself. I've also worked with culinary organizations to strengthen standards around creative attribution and recipe credit. I've presented at industry conferences about recognizing and preventing systematic credit theft in professional kitchens. I've advocated for clearer norms about documenting recipe authorship and attributing dishes properly in food media. These advocacy efforts have created cultural shifts in how the restaurant industry thinks about creative credit. Culinary schools now teach students about documenting their work and protecting intellectual property. Food publications have become more careful about verifying who actually created dishes before attributing credit. The professional culture has moved toward greater honesty and accountability, however incrementally. 7 years after opening Étoile, I received the James Beard Award for Best Chef, New York City. Standing on stage accepting the award, holding the medallion that represented peer recognition as one of the city's best chefs, I felt profound validation and gratitude. The award ceremony included a video presentation highlighting my culinary journey, the recipe theft I'd endured, and how I'd built Étoile into one of New York's most respected restaurants. During my acceptance speech, I spoke honestly about recipe theft and creative attribution in professional kitchens. For years, someone else took credit for dishes I created, recipes I developed, techniques I'd learned through a decade of training. The experience taught me that documentation matters, that truth matters, and that we as a culinary community need to protect chefs' creative work and ensure proper attribution. I hope my story helps other chefs recognize that their recipes, their creativity, their work deserves protection and credit. The speech resonated throughout the industry. I received messages from dozens of chefs sharing their own experiences with credit theft and thanking me for speaking publicly about exploitation that often remains hidden. The conversation helped break the silence around creative theft that enables it to continue. Today, Étoile operates with a talented team serving exceptional food to guests from around the world. We've maintained our Michelin star for 7 consecutive years. My cooking continues to evolve seasonally while staying true to the core philosophy that defines my style: French technique, American ingredients, and genuine respect for both tradition and innovation. But the most meaningful outcome extends beyond my personal success and professional recognition. Young chefs now have better resources for protecting their creative work than existed when I started. Culinary culture has shifted toward greater transparency about authorship and attribution. The industry increasingly recognizes that recipe credit matters, that creative theft has consequences, and that chefs deserve recognition for the dishes they actually create. That's the ultimate result when systematic recipe theft meets someone skilled enough to succeed independently and determined enough to expose the truth publicly. Marcus DeLuca destroyed his restaurant career through his own dishonesty, losing everything he'd built on stolen creativity when truth emerged. I built a successful Michelin-starred restaurant on recipes I actually developed, protected by clear documentation and loyalty from the brigade who knew the truth. The culinary community learned that recipe fraud has serious consequences, that stolen credit ultimately collapses when truth emerges, and that integrity matters more than convenient misappropriation. My story validates that patience, documentation, and strategic action can overcome even systematic creative exploitation. That chefs don't have to accept partners stealing their work. That guests deserve honesty about who actually created the food they're eating. That professional communities can and should hold members accountable for creative fraud. The truth came out, protecting not just me but every chef who refuses to let their recipes be stolen and every diner who deserves honest representation about who created the dishes they love. The accountability serves justice and strengthens the profession we're all part of. Revenge.